You are on audio and video. You're all good.
Good. All right. Well, tonight I will be talking with C.W. Gortner, or Christopher, as he's known. Christopher has an MFA in writing and a background in both the fashion and the public health industries before he became a full-time writer. He's published 12 books of historical fiction. He's known for writing about strong, independent women such as Catherine de' Medici, Sarah Bernhardt, Marlene Dietrich, and one of my favorite books, Mademoiselle Chanel, about Coco Chanel, and now tonight about Jenny Jerome, whom we know of as the mother of Winston Churchill. So Christopher, welcome to our group.
Thanks for having me.
So most people think of Jenny Jerome as the American mother of Winston Churchill. But in your book, we learn so much more about her and her early life and her family, and what a complex and actually rather scandalous woman she was. So what interested you in writing a book about this interesting woman, Jenny Jerome?
I've always wanted to do something on her because as a little boy, I saw the BBC or Masterpiece Theater series that was done on her with Lee Remick, which was a long time ago. And I always found her really interesting. And the opportunity came up to write the book. It just seemed like the right time. I had never done an American protagonist before, an American woman before. And there was a lot of particular interest in this era in publishing. So it was just she'd always been on my radar as somebody I wanted to explore, but the opportunity just was right to do it now.
Good. Well, what fascinated me was that she sort of led the movement of a group of American heiresses who gravitated towards European aristocrats. They were sometimes called the husband hunters or the fishing fleet. And Jenny certainly led the way. And maybe you could tell us about that group and why they were popular and why they went to Europe and why the European aristocrats sought them out.
Well, at the time that Jenny went to Europe, that wasn't really a phenomenon yet. The aristocracy, particularly in England, was suffering from a series of encroachments over the years on land and privilege. So a lot of the estates were penurious. And Jenny just happened to meet Randolph Churchill when she was in England, but it was a love match, as I describe in the book. It wasn't an arranged thing. And they kind of had to fight opposition from the families in order to get married. And then what happened was her success as being one of the first sort of American millionaires' daughters to marry into the aristocracy kind of spurred this interest in upper class American families sending their daughters to Europe to snag an aristocrat, because the aristocrats needed the money, an infusion of cash to keep the estates going, and the titles were kind of coveted in the United States because we don't have nobility here. So we had wealth. So at this particular time in history, titles were celebrity. So the result of Jenny's marriage was they actually started publishing a quarterly where they would list eligible bachelors, and these girls would get on the ships and come over, to see who they could marry. And oftentimes the quarterly came out too late because it was just sort of a deluge of people getting married. But Jenny kind of started the trend, what we call these dollar brides. But it wasn't what she had set out to do. Her mother had brought her daughters to Europe with the intent of marrying well. That was always a goal amongst American wealthy families, but it wasn't intentional. She just happened to fall in love with the son of a duke, and he wasn't even the heir. So,
well, let's talk a minute about Jenny's own family. The relationship with her mother and father was rather unorthodox. And as you said, the mother embraced this whole move to Europe to introduced her three beautiful daughters to the European lifestyle. But talk a little about Jenny's own family and perhaps her mother and father's relationship.
Well, her father, Leonard Jerome, was a speculator. He made his money primarily during the Civil War in a variety of enterprises, like many people did. He was one of the first ones. Vanderbilts and Astors, they all made money this way. But he kind of went into areas of newspaper publishing and stock trading and railroads and stuff like that. And he was kind of, he wasn't so much, he was interested in the acquisition of wealth, but he also speculated. So he lost several fortunes over his lifetime. He built a race, he loved racehorses. So he built a really famous racing track in Jerome Park. And he kind of settled, they started out in Brooklyn, and then he built a big mansion in New York, which was very much the thing you did in those days when you had money. But he really wasn't interested in conquering society as a rule. His wife, on the other hand, was very interested in being part of what is called the 300, which was the 300 people that could fill Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Mrs. Astor was the Astors were sort of ruled the roost of New York society. So Jenny's mother was very, very interested in being part of that group, and they were excluded. The Jeromes were excluded for various reasons, mainly because you can't have a privileged group if you don't exclude somebody. So Leonard Jerome wasn't considered the right type of person. So that created a lot of frustration in the marriage, because Leonard Jerome, Jenny's father, really didn't care that he wasn't the right person. And Clara Jerome, Jenny's mother, cared very much that they weren't being received. And then he was a typical man of his era. He had mistresses quite openly that she tolerated, but he got signaled out for some of his investments during the Civil War, and kind of caused a financial crisis in the family. And Clara Jerome did something very unusual for a woman of her era. She kind of said, well, I don't want to put up with this anymore. She packed up her daughters and went to Paris. The excuse was Paris was a finishing school. Everything that was done in New York society in these days was emulated on what was going on in Paris, because we still had the Third Empire. The Napoleons were still, and everything was coveted. The manners, the way of dressing, the way of setting your table, all of that was an example. So going to Paris was sort of a time-honored ritual, and that Clara Jerome was able to go there and live there with her daughters was considered quite the coup. And then she got intimate with Empress Eugenie, the last empress of France, and got an entree into society, where she could introduce herself, number one, and get the recognition that she couldn't get in New York from the Astors. And by the way, imperial recognition, so it counted much more, and then introduce her daughters. So the Jeromes never divorced, but they never lived together again after that. They lived separately. And Jenny's mother is a difficult character, was a difficult personality. Some of the things she strived for would seem somewhat superficial to us in this age, but in that age, it counted for a lot. And she her kind of staking her claim and saying, I'm not returning to a husband who's unfaithful, and I'm not returning to a marriage where I'm unhappy, is kind of unusual. She's kept her home in Paris and lived in Europe the rest of her life. Leonard Jerome went through a lot of money and died much less rich than he started. So she came from a complicated family where, and part of the way her father viewed and spent money influenced Jenny a lot in the value she attached to money. So she could be quite reckless and extravagant too.
One of the most interesting characters you wrote about was Fanny Rinaldo, and she seemed to me like the one consistent, strong person in Jenny's life. And can you talk about Fanny a bit and the role she played?
Was a Bostonian, wealthy divorcee. She was a singer. This was an era where performing on the stage was considered even worse than many professions. But Fanny kind of got around that because she had money, and so she performed for salons and things like that. And Leonard Jerome loved music. He was a huge aficionado of music. He had a private theater, sort of a symphony hall built in their house, a theater where he had musical galas. And Fanny Arnold was invited to sing there. And she and Leonard Jerome became lovers. And Fanny became sort of this person in Jenny's life who kind of gave her an example of things that women could do that supposedly you couldn't do. Fanny later on became the mistress of Sullivan, of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, and she was sort of this unique woman who, because of her position in society and because of her wealth, she sort of flaunted rules. She kept a townhome in London. She spent part of the seasons as they were called, in London, and she sort of became sort of the maternal guidance that Jenny didn't get from her mother. Jenny had a difficult relationship with her mother because the expectations were so high. And Clara Jerome was not an accessible person emotionally. So Fanny became sort of that person for Jenny, and was in her life for most of her life, in fact.
That's what it sounded like. And that she seemed to always be there when Jenny was at a turning point or a crisis point.
Yeah.
And again, she was a bit unconventional and sort of encouraged that in Jenny, although maybe Jenny had plenty of that on her own. But I thought the role of Fanny was an interesting one because she was sort of that mother figure to Jenny. Now let's talk about Jenny's romantic life, shall we say. She was very appealing to men. I love the way you portrayed her. Sometimes it was just a look across a room at a party, and the gentleman would come over and ask Jenny to dance, and before you knew it, they were in bed together. But I loved all your descriptions of the various men in her life, but particularly interesting was the man who became King Edward VII, the Prince of Wales. So can you talk about him for a bit? Was he fun to write about?
Bertie was a lot of fun to write about. I mean, he's very famous for being quite the philanderer. His wife had a terrible time. His wife, I explored a lot of some of his wife's life in my previous novel, The Romanov Empress, because she was the sister of the Tsarina of Russia, Queen Alexandra. But Bertie, he was in the wings for so long as heir apparent that, as we know from modern history with Charles, although nowadays the monarchy has a much more structured way of putting people to work so that they're not just hanging around. In Victorian era, Bertie had a lot less to do. And so he filled his time with going to the theater. He loved theater actresses. We know of many of his mistresses that are famous because, like Lily Langtry, and he kind of, he was very popular. He must have had some sort of magnetic appeal other than just being a prince, because when I was researching him, he came across as a man who women genuinely liked to be with. They enjoyed their time with him, and it wasn't coercion or, I have to sleep with him because he's the prince. I'm sure there was some pressure psychologically, just the fact that the Prince of Wales had approached you. But a lot of women were long-term mistresses, and indicating that they enjoyed Bertie's time. And that certainly was the case with Jenny. I think they found kindred spirits in one another. They enjoyed each other for who they were as people, and there was no claim, because one of the safe things about being the mistress of the Prince of Wales was that you weren't going to have to worry about, we'd have to marry him or something. He was already married, and so there was safety in that. And Victorian England is known for being a very sort of outwardly puritanical society, and Victoria certainly did nothing to advance women's rights during her reign. But behind the scenes, there was a lot going on. And oftentimes having affairs when you were married was not only expected, but anticipated. And it was the safety of marriage that provided that outlet. Nobody was, as long as you were discreet, nobody got into a fuss, it was all going to go fine. So Bertie was a lot of fun to write about because I had written about him previously, and I was able to explore him a little before the time I'd written about him previously. And he's certainly a fascinating character. You know, a lot of facets to him.
And I liked that he remained loyal to Jenny, even when he became king and he was no longer having an affair with her. And she asked him for a favor about keeping one of her sons out of the war as long as possible. I thought he was interesting. But there's some other wonderful male characters in this story, and husbands and lovers of Jenny. Did you have another male character you enjoyed writing about, or a favorite one?
Well, I really liked writing about Randolph, her husband. I mean, there's little known about him. He's always sort of shunted aside as the man who had a very unpleasant death. But I found his complexity really interesting because the marriage with Jenny was one of mutual benefit and arrangement. They kind of they were sort of a political power couple. You know, the way we would look at the Clintons, or they kind of attacked politics together, you know, dividing and conquering, each in their own domains. But when they needed to come together, you know, Jenny was always there to support Randolph in his endeavors. And Randolph had come out of a very indolent background and upbringing, and really hadn't done much with his life before he met Jenny. And something about his alchemy with her spurred him to get into politics and to do quite well. And he was supposedly a really fiery orator. And we oftentimes forget that Winston Churchill, who's one of the most famous statesmen of the 20th century, comes out of these two people.
Yes.
You know, he's a direct distillation of his mother and his father. And his father's achievements and have been very overshadowed by Winston, of course. But I really liked writing Randolph. It took me a while to find him because there's not as much information about him. But I wanted to present a man who was complex and had his own demons and also his own strengths, and show how this marriage kind of became this power couple in political society and in society at large.
And in this book, it really does seem that Jenny loved him and he loved her.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this unusual couple, and I believe she helped write some of his speeches.
Yes.
Or critique them or help him practice.
She would edit, she helped him practice. He tended to be a little impulsive and erratic, and she kind of tempered that in him with his speeches and helped give him sort of this public orator skill. She would edit his speeches, and yeah, they were very much in love. I mean, I had no doubt based on my research that it was a love match, and it was an enduring love, even though they both were, you know, not faithful to one another. Randolph much more so than Jenny. But it's just interesting to explore him because he was the third son of the Duke, you know, who really had no benefit to being born the son of the Duke. He was going to inherit very little. He got very little from the estate itself. He sort of had just been wandering around kind of figuring out what to do with himself. And he cut a figure in Victorian society through his marriage with Jenny that was quite impactful.
Do you think that Jenny felt a little at a loss when Randolph died, kind of about what would she do next, or
most definitely. Oh yeah, I think in the book I kind of explored that, you know, as much as I could. I mean, she had such an eventful life. The challenge with novels like this isn't what you include, it's what you don't include. You know, what do I not include? But certainly, I think she felt a great loss, years and years of marriage, decades of marriage to a man that complimented her in so many ways. And I think it fueled some of her later decision making. I think the marriage she had after Randolph was very much a disastrous one, and it's a direct result of the grief over Randolph, her inability to distinguish what was right for her. I think Jenny yearned always for companionship because she had had it all of her life. There had always been someone in her life. She'd had her husband, And being a woman alone in those days was very difficult. And she sort of struck out on her own and did things on her own. But I think she always yearned for that companionship. And I think Randolph was the love of her life. I think her third marriage was a very good one and would have been it ended prematurely due to her death. But I think he sort of was the man that most understood her, and she most understood him.
That's interesting. One of the things I loved in the book was when you would describe the clothes that Jenny wore, or her sisters, or the other people in the book, and you described the clothes, the fans, the shoes, the hairdos, the star pin that she would wear in her hair. But you also described the clothes of the men very beautifully, whether they were in uniform or evening dress. And I wondered, is some of that because of your background in the fashion industry? Do you like to describe the clothes that people wear?
Yeah. It's also one of my favorite eras for clothing. I love the late 19th century, especially for men's clothing. Really beautiful, the cravats and frock coats. It's a really beautiful era. Men dressed really well, I think, in that era. For women, it was extraordinarily uncomfortable, especially the Victorian era. But when you get into the Edwardian period, women's clothing starts to loosen up a little bit. You get the return of the Empire waistline, and you get some of the looser cuts on the dresses. And it's really a beautiful era. And it's been immortalized in a lot of movies because of it. I think it's one of the most popular eras for film because of it. So, and a lot of the descriptions of the clothing come directly out of the sources. I mean, Jenny actually did wear a bodice made out of iridescent African beetles shells one night, which she could barely move in, which of course now is completely, it's environmentally so wrong. But at the time, she was quite the fashion plate and was known for wearing clothing extraordinarily well. She had quite a unique approach to clothing, which made her stand out. And because she was physically quite arresting as well, quite beautiful, the package was really kind of stunning. And it was important because in those days, how you dressed and how you presented yourself was very important.
In fact, the mother took them promptly to Paris and to Worth to have Worth design dresses for all three girls, knowing that that would attract the wealthy aristocrats when they saw these beautifully dressed, beautiful girls.
Even some of the wealthiest people in New York couldn't afford.
Yes.
So when you wore a particular, Worth was one of the first couturiers of what we now know as fashion designers of that era. And he made his name, based on making this kind of brand type of couture. It was very coveted. So yes, and women bought wardrobes for seasons. You never wore the same dress twice. And God forbid you should both show up in the same one. So at all costs, that was a disaster that had to be avoided. So I love doing clothing in my books, and I think it's important, especially in this particular era, to show that, to show how much clothing impacted the way you were received and seen in society.
And it did, and it influenced how people felt about these women. Right. I saw Jenny as having quite an entrepreneurial spirit when she got a ship together or a boat to go take supplies during the Boer War, or when she started a hospital during World War I. Did you have a sense that she was an entrepreneur or just an idea, get it done person?
I think that in a different time, Jenny probably would have been somebody who would have ran a business, or maybe even gotten into politics herself. Because of the restrictions at the time on women in that era, I think that, a lot of what she did was considered scandalous, opening up her own theater and writing her own play. At one point, she was redecorating and flipping houses. The Boer War was something that she sort of, got herself together. I think she had sort of that can-do spirit of the United States, because many of the people who were wealthy, they had that spirit. They built fortunes based on enterprise, building railroads across the country and all of the things that were done to make money and build these fortunes. And And she came out of that spirit, which the aristocracy in England didn't have as much of, because it was generations of money was just handed down. And you weren't expected to put yourself out there and get things done. Certainly not to the level that Jenny did. I think in a different time, she definitely would have been a businesswoman. I think she had the zeal for it. But I also described in the book how she doesn't know how to handle money at all, because no one had ever taught her to, so-called balance a checkbook. So she operated at a deficit because of the way girls were raised.
And her father had been such a speculator. He'd made and lost fortunes, and her finances seemed to be up and down, and probably drove a lot of the decisions.
Yes, she could be very, very extravagant.
Although interestingly, her second two husbands, she didn't marry for money particularly.
No, Jenny never married for money. She wouldn't have married Randolph if that had been the case. He really had none. I mean, they had an estate, but he wasn't going to inherit. And certainly his proceeds from the estate, what he was receiving as a monthly pension, it wasn't even enough to keep them floating. One of the reasons Randolph went into politics was one of the few things that aristocrats were allowed to do outside of being an aristocrat. So, and it brought a stipend in. So yeah, she was reckless with her money because she was never taught that there was a way to be done. And I showed that in the book, especially around what happens with her sons later, when they kind of had to like put a rein on her. She was just kind of burning through cash.
Well, let's talk for a minute about Jenny the mother, because again, that's how most of us have sort of always heard of her, just as the mother of Winston Churchill. And after reading your book, it's hard to believe she was Winston Churchill's mother, because it's just not how I found it hard to believe. And so talk about what kind of a mother you think she was.
Well, I mean, again, one of the things I always do when I write these novels is that if I start passing judgment on my character, it ceases to be about the character and it starts to be about my judgment.
Yeah.
So one of the things I always practice when I write is to remove my judgment. I leave that up to the reader to decide whether they approve or not. With Jenny, aristocratic women didn't raise their children, not the way we're accustomed to thinking of what mothers do. They had staff, and they had households to run, and they had husbands to support, and society things to attend, and seasons to deal with. And children in the Victorian era really there wasn't a childhood. The notion of childhood is a relatively recent concept. Children were expected to be quiet and do as they were told and stay out of the way until they were old enough to be of use. So I think that Jenny was a neglectful mother to her sons in their younger years. She certainly wasn't there a lot of the time. She was away in London. They were being raised at Blenheim. We see Winston going to boarding school and having a lot of trouble. But I think later on she made up for it. And I think she always carried, as a mother would, residual guilt over not have been present during those formative years of their life. But again, not in her defense, but to explain the era, Jenny wouldn't have had if someone had said to her, "You're missing out on your child's formative years," she wouldn't have known what you were talking about. It just wasn't a concept at the time.
And she had a very strong mother-in-law who was on the scene and there at Blenheim with them. It seemed like she enjoyed them more when they got older, and she was very fond of her son Jack. It's funny, we don't talk about him as much, Winston Churchill's brother. I don't think Winston and Jack were particularly close, but Jenny seemed to have a genuine relationship with them when they became young adults and when they married.
Very much so.
And she did have input and influence in Winston's career. I remember reading a book about Winston Churchill when the Boer War was going on, and Jenny had very much encouraged him to go be a part of that war and make a name for himself. She thought he was, I think, only about 21 or 22, but go off and report on the Boer War and make a name for yourself and get your career going. So she was kind of pushy about career things for Winston, at least, and he probably needed it.
I think, I mean, I didn't read that. I mean, I know she was concerned about him becoming a war journalist because of the dangers that was posed. But I think that Jenny wanted both her sons to have careers because she had come out of a relationship with Randolph where she had seen what being raised aristocratic meant. These men just sort of lived on their privilege. And because of her relationship with her in-laws, specifically the Duchess of Marlborough, who had seized control of her children's upbringing and sort of never really liked Jenny, they never really saw eye to eye. I think that she definitely didn't want her sons to repeat this experience that Randolph had gone through, and she had seen the Duchess of Marlborough's other sons go through. I mean, none of her sons turned out to be particularly impressive. Of all of them, Randolph was the one who achieved the most. So I think she was genuinely interested in her sons pursuing a career in the sense of they needed a profession, something to do with their time and with their energy. And also financially, none of them were going to benefit much from being, part of the Churchill family. They had the name, but there wasn't a lot of wealth to be had. So yes, I think in that instinct, she became much more influential in both their lives as they grew up, and she wanted to guide them into areas where Jack became a stockbroker eventually, a successful one, and Winston, we know, he went on to a difficult and challenging career, but certainly a stellar one.
What other of the characters you wrote were favorites, or have we covered them?
Well, I mean, I like them all. I mean, all of them I have, you have to practice empathy as a writer. So even the Duchess of Marlborough, I understood her position. She thought her son was marrying a wealthy American girl. It turns out there wasn't that much money, and the American girl was more trouble than she was worth. So, but she delivered an heiress spare, and that was, worth noting. I like them all. I mean, the book is very much centered on Jenny, but all of the characters were worth exploring and writing about. And I even enjoyed very much exploring her mother, because I think Jenny Jerome's frustrations were very apparent, in her life and the difficulties that she came across. Jenny's relationship with her sister was really interesting to me. She and Clarissa were very close for most of their lives. And even though they quarreled and sparred as sisters will, in the end, they were there for each other. These three sisters were very close, and they had this bond between them, all three of them. And they all ended up marrying, but neither Clarissa nor Leonie, Jenny's sisters, had a marriage as successful as Jenny did. So yeah, all the characters you have to practice empathy with all of them.
That's true. One person we haven't talked about much was her second husband. He sounded so dashing and handsome, but was there more to him?
Oh, he had issues. He certainly had issues. And then I think partially Jenny's sort of insistence that he not pursue his military career after sort of the Boer War kind of pushed him into an inability to know what to do with himself. Again, someone well-born who wasn't quite sure what to do with himself. And so he sort of careened into gambling, drinking. He certainly wasn't, I didn't find him particularly pleasant as a person. I think she fell in love with an ideal rather than the actual person. And then she discovered that the actual person wasn't the ideal at all. But again, a man who had his own challenges in life, and certainly being married to Jenny brought challenges. She probably wasn't the easiest person to be married to.
And
But she
again,
went off to help Winston whenever Winston needed help, and that frustrated him. And yeah, it was sort of not a very good arrangement.
I like the way near the end of the book, it sort of circled back about Jenny thinking about Randolph and her life with him. And
Well, like I said, I think it was always the driving.
Yeah.
I think that was a relationship that the loss of Randolph was something she felt the rest of her life. And she tried to recreate it. Now, her third marriage was with a man who was had a much stronger character, and a man who had achieved a lot on his own. And so I think they saw each other much more eye to eye. And that would have been interesting. And for the rest of his life, he never capitalized on his romance with Jenny. And by then, she was extraordinarily famous on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, she was a personality. She appeared in society pages. People knew who she was. And he never sought to capitalize on his marriage with her. So, but I think the loss of Randolph was something that haunted her. She wasn't able to quite overcome it.
Well, this was a eye-opening read for me to learn all these other facets about Jenny and the impact she had. I mean, if you think about it, she was in the Victorian era and the Edwardian, and then the beginning of new, more modern ways, and she sort of transcended all of those. She was fascinating and multidimensional and complex. And for those of you who are listening who haven't read this book, it's a delight. And one of those books you want to keep reading to see what she's going to be up to next. So if we need to leave some time for questions, if anybody in the audience would like to pose a question, you can do that on the Q&A function, and we can ask Christopher to answer it.
I can't see the Q&A function. You can, right?
Yes, but I haven't seen any questions yet. Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't asked you about the book?
No, I mean, I think I'm glad that you feel that way about the book, and I've had a lot of different reactions to it, as I always do in my work. I think it's important always to judge people based on their period, on their time. So it's always interesting to see how people react to a story like this. I do think there's a question of what's the next book? I can't talk about it right now because I'm under contract, but I'm going to go into a more modern era, and I'm going to write about another fashion designer.
So you can tell us that much.
That much I can say.
Yes. All right, that's good. So somebody's asking about Jenny. How old was she when she died, and how old was Winston?
Oh, God, I don't even remember. How old was Jenny when she died?
I think 67.
I think 67 or 62 or 65. And Winston was in his 30s. Winston was in his 30s, I believe. You know, her death was accidental. So
I think Randolph was in his 30s.
Yes, Randolph was in his late 30s, early 40s.
And I know Winston Churchill died in 1965. I can't remember when he was born, but he was in his 70s, I think, when he died.
Yes.
And Jenny was 67, and we won't tell you how she died. You'll have to read the book. It's quite dramatic, is all I can say. So somebody is asking, what influence did she have on Winston when he was prime minister? But I believe she was,
because she was to see it. So one of the interesting things for me about writing the book and exploring Winston was that we always see him in our minds and in our imagination after, you know, as the prime minister facing World War II and all that. But there's all of this life that comes before that. And that's what you see in American Adventures, is you see the young man who started out wanting to be a journalist and then sort of got into politics, sort of almost unwillingly, and then sort of started gathering momentum in that arena and had several setbacks in his political career, which we see in the book.
And this is when Jenny was encouraging him and nudging him, because he was having a very bumpy start in his professional life.
Yeah, she did definitely encourage and push him to get into politics because it was an arena she knew.
Yeah, and she always reminded him that he was a good speaker.
Yes.
And that he could influence people.
Yeah, he had that. Well, it was what he inherited from his father, was this oratorical skill that she knew he could take advantage of. So absolutely. But she never saw him become prime minister. She would have been very proud, I think.
Somebody is asking, how did Jenny handle her husband's illness, Randolph being?
Well, probably wasn't easy because it was kept a secret. Nobody knew what Randolph had. It was a disease that carried a lot of stigma, syphilis at the time. Although we now know that it was endemic in Victorian society and it was affecting all levels of Victorian society, from prostitutes in the street to the upper class. I mean, it wasn't a discriminatory illness, certainly. I think the last years of Randolph's life were extraordinarily difficult because Randolph, though he never showed the full exhibits of insanity that late-stage syphilis often creates in people, he was very erratic, and he had a very difficult death, hard death. And he sort of wanted to travel a lot, sort of incessantly. And that was very exhausting on Jenny. I think it was probably a very difficult time for her. So even though losing him was very hard on her, it's something she never quite overcome, I think seeing him deteriorate the way she did probably would have been extraordinarily painful for her.
So somebody is asking, how did Jenny's sons, Winston and Jack, feel about her infidelities?
Well, I think that they didn't know about them until later. I mean, they certainly didn't know about it when she was married to Randolph because they were far away and it wasn't something you discussed with the children. I think later on, they were, I mean, I think in the book I believe that Winston talks to Jenny a little bit about her affair with Bernie.
Yes, right near the end.
Yes. I think Winston was probably somewhat affable about it. I mean, by that point, they had seen that their mother was sort of this dynamic force. They couldn't be, I think they were much more concerned about her choice of husbands than her choice of lovers.
And somebody wanted to know the names of her second and third husbands.
Gosh, I wrote the book over 2 years ago, so I totally don't remember.
Well, there was Montague, the second.
Montague was the
third one.
The third one. And who was the second one? George Cornwallis West.
The very handsome, narrow-waisted.
George Cornwallis West. Very handsome, sort of debonair. But he was just a guard, he was in one of the Queen's regiments.
But those uniforms.
Yes.
Someone else is asking, who are your favorite authors?
Who are my favorite authors? Oh, that's an interesting question. I have a lot of them. I always hate picking out people to signal out. I love reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I grew up reading a lot of him. He's one of my favorite writers. There's a Greek writer, Nikos Kazantzakis, who wrote The Last Temptation of Christ, which is he's a really marvelous writer. He's written another book about his spiritual awakening and sort of quest called Report to Greco, which I really love. I read a lot of fantasy, to be honest. I read a lot. So there's a Canadian author named Guy Gabriel Kay, who I really love. He writes fantasy novels, but they're based on historical eras. And then he sort of transposes them into a fantastical sort of world that he creates. He's quite wonderful at what he does. So those are some of my favorites.
Good. Someone is asking, have you had any interest in someone making a movie of any of your books?
Well, of course. Yeah, absolutely. One of my book, Marlene, about Marlene Dietrich, has been optioned for a limited miniseries. All that means is that producers have taken the book and they're attempting to get someone a streamer or a studio to pick it up for a limited series. But the producers are pretty well known in the industry, and they've been at it for a number of years now. and they've kept at it. They really believe in the project. So I'm hoping that happens. That would be great. Absolutely. I mean, that's something you always would love to see. The author has very little control over that. We also have very little control of what it's going to actually look like when it happens, because the way those contracts are set up, we really can't influence it. I mean, unless you're George R. R. Martin. And yet he probably didn't have that much influence the first season of Game of Thrones. He had it later when it became such a popular concept. But yes, of course, I'd love to.
Can you tell us some of the titles of your other books?
Yeah, sure. The Last Queen is my first one. It's about the daughter of Isabel of Castile. Her name is Queen Juana. She's known as sort of the Mad Queen of Spain. And then there's, I got to look at my bookshelf, the Confessions of Catherine de' Medici. It's about Catherine de' Medici. And then the Queen's Vows about Isabella of Castile. So, and then the Vatican Princess is Lucrezia Borgia. So I wrote 4 books about women set in the Renaissance. And then I wrote Marlene Dietrich, Marlene, which is about the actress Marlene Dietrich, and Mademoiselle Chanel, which is about the designer Coco Chanel. And those are early 20th century. And then I kind of moved into the late 19th century. I'm not attracted to eras so much as I'm into personalities, and it just happened to be that all 3 women lived in that era. So the Romanov Empress is about Tsar Nicholas II's mother, who survived the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. The first actress is about Sarah Bernhardt, the French theater actress, which was a wonderful book to write because it explores the era of the courtesans in Paris. And then, what else? And then I have 3 novels that I've written about a Tudor spy called The Tudor Secret, Tudor Conspiracy, and The Tudor Vendetta. And then I have The American Adventurers. So I'm kind of promiscuous when it comes to eras, but it's not deliberate. It's sort of just, it's when the character comes to.
One thing I didn't say in the introduction is that you are half Spanish. I think I read, and you were raised in Spain.
Yeah, my mom is from Madrid, and I was raised in southern Spain. I was born in the United States, but my parents moved our family back to Spain in the early 1970s. I was just a boy because they wanted to raise us in a different environment, and I stayed in Spain until I was 12 years old. So I have Spanish by birth.
Somebody else wants to know about how you do historical research, even though these are novels.
It depends on the character. I mean, it always starts with reading as many biographies as I can of the character to get a sense of them. And I like to read a number of biographies because every biographer is going to have a different look on the character. I like to get a lot of different perspectives. If there's any contemporary or extant information that the character actually put in writing, then I like to get a hold of that. Oftentimes that's not possible with my Renaissance women. They almost left nothing of their personalities in writing. So you have to sort of create a psychological profile of them based on their actions and what is known about them. In a case like Jenny, she did write a biography, but it's so heavily censored and fictionalized. It's hard to take it as, and then I do a lot of secondary research into era. And, that's very consuming because I'll research things like how long it took to get from one place to the other on a train or on a carriage. The reader won't notice this, but to me, it's really important to know how long did they stay in a carriage. And, did she arrive at Blenheim Palace desperate to go to the bathroom, only to find there's only one bathroom in the entire palace? So the research is kind of ongoing while I'm writing too. So I do enough to start working, and then I research as I go.
So what is your writing process, and how disciplined are you about your writing?
Well, I try to write every day. It's a muscle. It needs to be exercised. I often write in the morning until lunchtime, and then I break. And then I'll often kind of rest after that and do some reading. And then in the early evening before dinner, I might go back and do some editing or a little bit more writing. And then once I have enough of the book written, I kind of warm up in the morning by editing what I wrote before I plunge into the blank page. But my contracts are usually for 18 months from the time I signed the book to when I had to deliver the manuscript. It's not a long time to write a book, a novel, especially particularly a historical novel. So I sort of have to be pretty disciplined to get the work done.
Do you take a break though, ever completely and go on a trip or, for a month or something?
I do after I finish the novel and it's been delivered. Depending, I mean, I've been doing that more recently. At the beginning of my career, I was sort of delivering a book and signing a contract and starting to work on another book because the process of publication is so slow. By the time I've delivered a novel, it's been edited and it's come back to me and they've done the cover, and it's a year before the book is actually out in bookstores. So I spent that year writing a new one. But in recent years, I've been giving myself more time. Oftentimes because the characters I've been exploring have demanded more of me, and publishing has changed a lot. It's not so easy anymore to publish a book and do well with it. So I'd rather not have so much coming out back to back. So yeah. But after I write a book, I always have a couple, like at least a month or two, where I just sort of have to decompress.
That's good. Thank goodness. Well, we will look forward to your next book. When will it be out?
I don't know. The delivery date's not till 2024. So
Okay.
I'm still in the research process right now. This is going to be, the character I'm exploring is a woman who inspired a fashion designer and worked side by side with the designer and sort of influenced an era, but there's not a lot known about her. So it's a more challenging book than I've had in the past research because I don't have a full biography. So I'm having to kind of piecemeal stuff together. But it probably would be out in 2025, so about 2 years from now.
All right. Well, we will be waiting for your next book, and thank you for writing this one, which is just intriguing for those of you who have not yet read it. And we'll look forward to the next book, and we wish you good luck on it. And thank you for being our guest tonight on Sweet Thursday.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.